Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Cybersecurity Maturity, an Evolution of Cybersecurity Leadership. I'm Amber Noble, a marketing specialist at Barracuda MSP, and I'm happy to be moderating today's session. Today, I'm joined by Chris Johnson, Cybersecurity Compliance Strategist at Pinpoint Solutions, LLC. During today's educational webinar, Chris will walk us through actionable advice on how managed service providers can approach clients about new cybersecurity services. Before we get started, let's do some brief housekeeping. During the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to share them using the questions or chat panels to the right of the Zoom webinar screen. At the conclusion of the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a brief polling survey. Please take a moment to tell us what you think so we can continually improve the content and quality of our online events. With that out of the way, let's get to today's topic. Chris, why don't you start us off by telling us a little about your background in the industry? How'd you get where you are with Pinpoint Solutions?
Sure, Amber. Thanks for having me on this panel or this webinar. I've probably been doing focused cybersecurity consulting going on probably 6 years now. Roughly 2008, 2009, I started in the managed services space with the idea, like many managed service providers, of every potential client prospect as a potential, new stream of revenue. And so one of the challenges we found right away is that to distinguish ourselves from, say, the competition, or just to show industry expertise, we needed to sort of narrow that focus. And it probably took us a good, I'm going to say 3 years at least, before we really started clicking away on what the niche would be. And at that time, I was running a company called Actionable Solutions. Later we sold. But the premise of that business and leading up to the sale, roughly 9 or so years after it started, was our focus on both a particular vertical. We were focused on the healthcare space, and then second, with the idea around helping our clients either meet regulatory compliance or come up with a set of standards or controls that would allow them to have a security posture that they could feel confident in an event of an audit or a breach, that they'd have something to stand on to show that they didn't just stand by and let bad things happen. And so that's kind of how this all came about. And then as I kind of moved on and worked in other MSPs, I realized that I needed to probably do this again with sort of a different model. And this time around, the model being, how do I make sure that before I position myself with my prospective clients, how do I make sure that I can provide the evidence to support that I'm doing the things that I'm asking of them?
That's really, really interesting. And it's great to hear, that it evolved in that way. And now I know I did say webinar at the beginning, but I think today we're going to take this more of a conversation with some visual aid. What do you think about that, Chris? Sound good?
I think that's a lot better of an idea, because no one wants to hear my voice drone on by itself. It needs some ambient sounds to go with it for sure.
So let's dive in. Cybersecurity maturity. I think we're all pretty aware of the cybersecurity part of this. It's the industry that we're in. But what part does this play when you say maturity? How does this really work into being a better industry leader?
Sure. So I think the easiest way to do it is to look at it from a cybersecurity leadership perspective or leadership delivery perspective. When we talk to our clients or prospective clients, they're already, if they haven't already identified us as a expert or thought leader, it's definitely one of the reasons that they're putting us in that conversation, right? They're not just going out and Googling, I hope you're an expert, and then my company comes up, right? Or your company comes up. It's going to be, they need specific things. And when they search for regulatory compliance or any number of security challenges that are out there, they're looking either for products or services that they assume when you're in that conversation that you can deliver there. And so what I've done over the last couple of years is I've put together what I think are kind of the 4 or 5 major sort of categories that are at first self-reflective before you can do client-facing. It's not to say that if you aren't already selling some of these products and services that you can't turn it on yourself and get there quickly to support that go-to-market strategy that's already maybe in place. But I think it helps in the long-term business model of being able to truly position as a security expert. And security isn't really good by itself. It's, I think, cybersecurity. I'm not an expert on whether or not there are certain brands of handcuffs that are better than others or how thick the bars need to be on your windows. This really is about what happens in the ones and zeros space that we're all trying to defend against preemptively. So the first one is sort of that strategic development piece that helps sort of set the framework for where you want to go as an organization. And so that would step us into, I've got some tools that, I can make available afterwards, but basically it's where am I at today and where do I want to go? So if I have a security model that says I've got a repeatable model that I can do over and over and again, but I want to be in a optimized model where, I have a good predictable strategy in place for all of my different categories that are sort of defined by NIST, I've got that in place. The operational or capability component is really getting into, as you start developing your programs in-house, how do I show and continuously improve that? It's not a set it and forget it. And then as you continue through this with the GRC, what are the risks that my organization is taking? What are the types of clients that I'm targeting? What are their risks? How does that play into the products and services I'm trying to position there? And of course, and the latter part of this is being able to provide evidence that supports that same maturity. So it's not just I took a class, I did some training. It's being able to show real hard evidence that says whether we're using, the Barracuda solution stack or another vendor stack, or maybe there's a combination of different vendors' products in there that you can articulate not just we use these products and services, but here's how we implement them, and here's how we've mapped them to a set of standards or controls that gives some assurances that we're not just fly by the seat of our pants, every client that comes through our front door, prospective client, here's an easy, just follow along because this vendor does a good job. And then of course, the last one is the preparedness. So if I do all of these four things well, then it's going to get into being prepared for the events that are not an if question, it's a when question. And I think that's the one that I would probably argue is the one that's left out the most. So, we do a good job of building up to, we've got everything in place, but when it comes to that business continuity, disaster recovery setup, we kind of walking on shaky ground, if you will. So that's kind of how I've broken it down. I'm not necessarily saying that these are the 5 golden pieces, because I think everybody's going to approach cybersecurity a little bit differently. But I think that at least 3 of the elements that are in here are going to set the stage or the parameters around any strong cybersecurity program. And just to kind of reiterate that, I pulled up now, this would be an example of having walked through, a functional maturity model. What does it look like if I was to go out and provide cybersecurity leadership services? What does that look like? I think it's important to note that most of the organizations are going to start somewhere in that level 1, level 2. In the years that I've been doing this, I can count on one hand the number of businesses, whether they were other MSPs or clients of mine or other MSPs. And that is, they're in that, for the most part, they're in the 2, but they're definitely in a manual, not exactly a repeatable process. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell, that whole, where am I right now before I can go out and position this elsewhere.
Excellent. So what would you say is the top security challenge that people are facing with this?
Well, I think it's and I just pulled this up. I think it's pretty straightforward, as clear as mud is, I guess, the way I would put it. You've got roughly all these different major categories, and what you run into is you have what pieces of this is my organization either current delivering on, what is my organization currently being asked to deliver on, and where are the areas that we haven't even thought about yet, but they're out there and we need to plan that way. So I use this in a lot of other conversations and presentations. In fact, this was actually pulled from some CompTIA collateral, and then you could literally take a pen or a pencil and start circling elements in each one of these categories, right? So you do a perimeter firewall, check that box. What about web application firewalls? And you circle that one. And then you start kind of looking at where are the areas that maybe up to this point you just called managed services and you really haven't articulated or delineated between where that gets into providing security or security type of service versus just keeping the lights on so that you can continue being productive and working.
And I totally get that, finding the gaps and really like trying to, you know, see where you can improve, because I look at probably hundreds of different, you know, MSP sites every week, just as, you know, a small part of what I do on the marketing team. And it's so varied what different managed service providers actually offer.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's easy to offer a product and service, right? Not because we necessarily are experts on any one specific area, but when a client, especially existing clients, come to us and say, I need intrusion detection, and they do it very, you know, almost it's in panic because someone said something to them in a meeting, or they had something happen. I mean, quite often these things are driven by a fear component, right? They had something bad happen, so the consequences are definitely going to be severe, and they're trying to preemptively get in front of it so that they can say, but look, we're doing these things now. So I think that it's easy to pick from the smorgasbord, and more importantly, find one that the client is asking for, put a price tag to it, sell it. Whether you're making money or losing money is neither here nor there. You're delivering on what your client asks for. I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing in the space today a lot of MSPs partnering with each other or partnering with vendors to help deliver services that they're not comfortable delivering on their own. But more importantly, we have a tendency today, anyways, to reactively put these products and services in place. And I think there's an opportunity to go out there and do this with a proactive approach that says, I know that my gaps in the following categories are X. And so if you maybe don't want to focus on being the security operations center for your client's needs, but you are going to consider outsourcing it, you know, let's do it now, not when your client says, oh, by the way, we have this huge breach, our firewall was compromised. And it's something that feasibly could have been avoided, or at least had the ramifications or consequences of what happened been minimized just from a haven't been ready for it. Ready can actually be a thing. So that kind of gets into this sort of, I say this because I pulled up a slide, but we talk about when we look at both ourselves and our clients, whether we're using Netrix or Rapid Fire Tools or some of the other products that are out there to help us identify areas of vulnerability or risk. I think that that's something that we take for granted in implementing tools. I actually saw on Facebook, somebody had posted, you know, what is the risk or security assessment tool that you use in your organization? And it was kind of polling, you know, different vendors' products. And one of the things that came up through that was, I hope you're not just using one tool, which is a really important thing to think about, is that there's no one perfect tool when you're talking about security and risk, because if there was just one tool that works that way, there would be a lot less competition in the space, because we'd essentially say that, you know, all products and services are created equal, and that you're going to be in the price competitive game of who's the low cost, you know, to make this, your margins of profitability higher. And what's interesting about that is it depends on what you're looking for. You know, you could get into an argument over antivirus products, but they all have kind of the same goals in mind. But when you get into tools like risk assessment, where you're looking at more of a holistic approach to the ecosystem, it's not about whether or not the products and services are created equally. It's about what are the things that you're trying to uncover. And quite honestly, the more tools in your toolbox that are somewhat unique, and with overlap, of course, but you're going to find things that one tool catches and another tool doesn't. And that's why it's important, as you go through this maturity process of, plan, do, check, act, is that you're constantly looking to improve, which means that you're constantly evaluating in your areas of risk assessment, either new tools or variations on existing tools, maybe even approaching how you implement those tools differently, so that the challenges that you face can be met head on, and you're not, afraid of what's behind door number 3.
Totally, I get that. I mean, in this, field, the threats are constantly evolving too. And I apologize to the listeners today. It's a little hard for me to talk, a bit of a sore throat over here, but yeah, with the constantly evolving threats, it only makes sense that the tools to fix and detect those threats would also have to constantly be evolving, and that there would be holes as you build up one tool, maybe another tool is going to do a better job. And that's something that we really look at here with Barracuda. Just recently, we acquired an RMM tool to add to our multi-layered approach to, really help fill in those gaps in our own, segments.
And, regarding RMM tools, that's an interesting one that you bring up, because one of the things that has plagued MSPs for years is that we were notorious for, going back 4 or 5 years, maybe a little longer, when the idea around managed services really started to become popular. We would do things like, if I can automate the management of the user or the device in any way, shape, or form, then that reoccurring model of me having a transaction-based relationship with a client was heavily reliant on how good my RMM tool was to provide reporting and successful patching, you name it. But one of the things that a lot of MSPs did take for granted is that, unfortunately, it's a tool, right? So if we're looking at this through the lens of security, no one tool being perfect, it's how frequently are you going back and investigating when you do get that alert that says, failed to update the latest security vulnerability patch from Windows, and it'll catch it on the next time around. Next week it'll get it. And by no fault of the tool, it actually was the fault of us as MSPs, who essentially have built out a solution stack that, in the event that there were to be a lot of failures at any one point in time, our resources internally were not vast enough to take on that responsibility all at once. So that's one of the things that I keep, hammering on, is what is the strategy around reviewing what your RMM tool tells you, what your risk assessment tools are telling you, because I think the RMM tool is a perfect example of what should make up and be a part of a risk assessment, because the information coming out of those RMM tools it's kind of like the data that you wish had come sooner, because if you would have looked at it, it's been there the whole time. We just don't run the reports frequently enough because we can't consume all that information. So
now, would you say, with the businesses that you've worked with, that there's a common issue that really, keeps coming up when they try and adapt into, these new strategies, into closing these holes? Is there like a specific issue, maybe with company size or anything along those lines, that, really is reoccurring?
I don't want to say that all problems are created equal, because we could create the argument that everyone is a snowflake. I think we really, truly are. But when a snowflake melts, it's water, and so are all snowflakes. So this has kind of been, always trying to think about how do we describe our clients, and we all argue that each one thinks that they're a snowflake. We can't create repeatable strategies in the cybersecurity space because they are all the same. That being said, when you melt it all down, it's still water. So I think that the problems being unique, or the problems being, depending on size of MSP, are different. I think it really just comes into more of a scale scenario. So hopefully the smaller the MSP, the smaller either client base they're targeting initially, or there's not as many clients that they're providing the services to sort of scale the resources appropriately. But it's hard to say beyond that if there's a consistency or a pattern that would say that it happens uniquely with one size organization versus another. I think it's similar or same problems, but just on a different scale.
Completely understandable. And you had mentioned some tools earlier on that could help people adapt these strategies better. Did you want to talk about those at all?
The tools are readily available out there to help identify areas of risk per se. So there's some security maturity tools out there that are in the form of Excel spreadsheets. I know Sigilant makes one readily available to those that go on to their website and sign up. There's a few others. CIS has in their for free downloads. They've got like their security top 20 controls that you can go in and sort of go through. And as you go through and address each control, you can kind of identify, do I do this well? Do I have something to position in this space? CompTIA, through their IT security community, they've got a couple tools. One of them is the security assessment. It's like a survey tool. It's not as popular as it once was, but one of the things that I always found value in it was that, it was a nice to use tool with your customers or your clients to say, okay, it asks questions like, what kind of firewall do you have in place? And you get answers like, I have a Sonic Wall firewall, or I have a Barracuda firewall. But the answer to that question wasn't, what brand of firewall do you have? It's what kind of firewall do you have? What is the firewall actually doing? And so as you go through and answer those questions, it helps identify a couple things. One, if I am my own client, my own customer, and I were to walk through these questions, how many of these questions that I know are important to a cybersecurity maturity model am I currently not doing or not doing well? And if I have gaps in there, then how can I possibly go out to my clients and say, these are the things we're going to have to address. And oh, by the way, I haven't addressed it in my own company. And we get into this excuse game that says, oh, well, most of our staff work from home. Okay, well, then what's the policy and procedures around working from home? Do you require certain hardware? Do you require certain firewalls? Do you force everybody through a VPN or two-factor authentication? The list just goes on and on and on, but that's the nature of the space that we're in, right? These are the things that we have to do. So I like to throw this out there. We are our own CISO, right? Whether we want to be or not, we have to provide these services to ourselves and to our clients. So I'm not saying this from the perspective of go out and sell CISO as a service, but more of this is a kind of a buzzword right now, has been for a while. We used to call it, virtual CTO or virtual CIO, and now CISO has taken that place. But the reality is someone in every organization has been given that title, that label, or that responsibility, even if they're shirking the title because they don't feel comfortable, putting the burden on their own shoulders. So these are some of the things that keep coming up that I think are important, but aren't necessarily what defines what we're doing. And I don't know if that made sense, but basically, when we talk about things like two-factor authentication, we get carried away with the blanket term of, do you use two-factor authentication? And it's not a yes or no question. It's an answer that has many different scenarios that have required different answers. So as an example, we had this come up not too long ago where we had a client ask us about two-factor authentication, and my question was, well, what are you using two-factor authentication for? And so as the conversation progressed, we came to understand that they had a client that for an application that they used, that they provided, they needed to be able to provide two-factor authentication for the clients so that they could meet certain regulatory requirements. But that opened the door for questions along the lines of, okay, in your own organization, how do I access the SQL database from a management standpoint? Does that require two-factor or elevated permissions that are a different user profile than the one I use to just log into my laptop? And because of those questions coming up, then it's not so much about two-factor authentication anymore. It's about what are the multi-factor authentication methods that I need to use that are backed up by policy and procedure based on the environment I'm trying to gain access to.
Absolutely. I wish I could speak more to it from personal experience, but I'm not the IT, person here. But we use it a lot ourselves. I'm happy to have it there, just as a way to really go through and add that extra layer of security, because I get what you're saying, the real life application of these services we're selling. Like, are we really applying them on our end?
Right. I think that's where this one comes into play, because, as I was previously with another MSP or MSSP, one of the things we talked about a lot was cybersecurity leadership delivered, and hiring the CISO is a big cost. But one of the things I think is important, particularly for MSPs, is how do you articulate and manage some of the things we've talked about, whether they're using the Barracuda RMM stack that was part of your recent acquisition, whether they're using your file-based backup or image-based backup solutions. What do all those look like as they play into a security model that says, in the event of disaster, I can help us recover from that? What are the risks and compliance efforts that we may be undergoing, but we haven't really documented? I think we're all the best at having, everything filed away, but instead of it being in some sort of digital file cabinet and easily accessible by everybody in the organization, it's in that beautiful file cabinet called our heads. And unfortunately, that has limited accessibility to others, particularly in the scenario where it's hit by bus, extremely sick and in a coma. It basically becomes non-existent, right? So I find that one of the most valuable pieces of any cybersecurity program isn't necessarily tied to how great of a security service offering stack you have, but how well the documentation of those elements that you do provide and how it's implemented so that evidence can be shown to support that's being done.
Absolutely. Just having that trail really to fall back
Correct.
on.
Yes.
That paper trail. Wonderful.
The paper trail is key.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the paper trail is key. And I think that a lot of organizations would like to say, when you do an assessment and it finds lots of bad things, you're like, hey, wait, don't make that the final assessment. We're going to go in and fix all these things. And then if you'd rerun the risk assessment and then tell us how great we're doing, that's what we want to do. The reality is when you make things really, really good, and then you run an assessment and it shows little to nothing that needs to be done, everybody gets suspicious.
Exactly. It's really errors, I say, make things more believable, and that's a large reason why I like to, do so many of these recordings and do so many webinars with people, but not, get rid of every little error. And because, I think if we all sounded like robots, there'd be a certain, level there where it would be harder to believe. And that definitely rings true when it comes to hard data, because, there is always going to be outliers in hard data. It's not always going to be perfect. So that really backs that up. We are coming up on the half hour now, and I want to leave time for the crowd to throw their questions out. But before that, Chris, do you have anything else that you really would like to highlight in this session before we open it up for questions?
So I think that the final thing I would leave with is this slide here is something that we did a couple of years back in CompTIA, and it's slowly been evolving and continuing to grow. And I don't know what the latest updates were, but it's this reminder that everybody is a participant in providing cybersecurity solutions and safeguards for their clients, whether they want to do that or not. But I think it's important to note that you don't have to jump off the deep end and begin providing pen testing and risk assessments and all these more advanced comprehensive security service stacks. But you can start, say, just with the foundational pieces, which in many cases are things you're already doing, but it's articulating that to the client, that these are elements of your security solution, that it's not just some unknown or it's a thing that's beyond reach because you don't have the budget for it. You have to start somewhere. And I think that we have a tendency to get into that whole blinky light syndrome where the client says, well, I need, and they'll list off things that fall into maybe a security category, but we're not talking about it from the perspective of the governance, risk, and compliance model. It says, but these aren't things that you're going to be exposed to as a business. So why are we spending money on these items when there are things over here that you haven't even thought about yet that maybe are a lot less dollar amount, but they're scary because it requires documentation to go with it. And I think it's important that we set realistic expectations both for ourselves and our clients that while these things are all achievable, we can't pull it off overnight.
100% understand that. So again, I do want to go ahead and throw out there, if anyone has questions for Chris, go ahead and pop them in the chat or questions panel if you have not already, and I'll read them off as they come in. In the meantime, I am going to launch that poll we discussed way back at the beginning. If everyone could just take a moment to tell us what you think about today's webinar. And Chris, while those questions are rolling, I just want to thank you so much for being here with us today. Phenomenal talking to you. You know, just some really great insight into cybersecurity leadership.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.